It is impossible for someone to show you that video from yesterday and prove to you, well, this is terrorism. But that message, because it was propagated so early by this administration, is being accepted by millions of people without a second thought. And that is very alarming because it expands beyond this incident. What happens when there's an act of terrorism? Well, what you do is you increase a law enforcement presence and you crack down on the potential perpetrators. There are folks inside this administration, people I worked with in the first Trump administration, who have been waiting for and looking for a pretext for a domestic terrorism crackdown.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. An innocent woman shot dead in her car by aggressive ICE officers who've terrorized the city, or a domestic terrorist who weaponized her vehicle and tried to kill an agent who was lucky to escape with his life. The competing narratives over what exactly happened in Minneapolis yesterday are now entrenched, and the fallout from the shooting has gone national and is going global. All this happening in the middle of President Trump's aggressive immigration push, with thousands of federal agents deployed to Minneapolis as the White House tries to demonstrate toughness ahead of the midterm elections. Protests are spreading, and the city has become the latest battleground in a national fight over immigration, policing, and political strategy. Well, today on the Forecast, we speak to Miles Taylor, who worked in the Department for Homeland Security in the first Trump administration and has since become a very vocal critic of the president, and Minneapolis-based journalist Madison McVan, who's been reporting from the scene. So let's just go, to the scene itself. Let's go to Minneapolis and talk to Madison. Madison, we saw the demonstrations last night. There was a vigil, I think, overnight. The actual shooting itself was played again and again and again on cable television, but with these two very different takes, depending on who you were watching. What's the latest, on the ground? What's the mood in the city? And to what extent do people there think that they are in the heart of this kind of battleground?
Well, the city of Minneapolis is no stranger to being at the heart of conversations about police brutality, and racial violence. This is where George Floyd was murdered in 2020. And
just a few blocks away, right?
Yeah. The shooting of Renee Good was just less than a mile from where the murder of George Floyd occurred. So this is a community that already is wary of law enforcement, that has come out and demonstrated in mass against law enforcement violence. And yesterday's shooting was definitely a reminder of that for the people of South Minneapolis. This morning, we saw some renewed protests at the federal building outside of Minneapolis, where the local ICE agency is headquartered. A complicating factor here is that, in 2020, the protests were against the Minneapolis Police Department specifically. And now we're seeing protests against federal law enforcement, which complicates things. ICE are not the people who are responding to protests. And so we didn't see things escalate, like they did in 2020 yesterday. There was some deployment of tear gas as ICE agents were leaving the scene. But, not that type of standoff as the Minneapolis police left, for example. So some key differences and some similarities to 2020 we're seeing here.
Yeah, and I want to get to the differences and especially the sort of potential pitting of federal agencies against local or state law enforcement agencies in a minute, because that could be quite dangerous. Just before we get to that, Madison, Minneapolis has had a very troubled recent history with ICE agents, hasn't it? And of course, it's not the only city that falls into that category. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. I think for people outside of the U.S., I think it's important to talk about the way that the residents of cities have been responding to ICE. There has been a mass movement to train people to alert the public when ICE is carrying out an operation, to come out and demonstrate and in some cases disrupt ICE operations. So that seemed to be kind of the situation yesterday when Renee Good was killed. There was a ICE vehicle that was stuck in the snow. Some people were blowing whistles, they were honking horns, they were drawing attention to the fact that ICE was present in the neighborhood, drawing people out to protest and disrupt. We don't know specifically what Renee Good was doing there. There's still a lot we don't know about what her involvement may have been in these organizations, but her car was parked there.
So we don't know, Madeleine, if she was part of that disruption exercise.
Eyewitnesses on the scene told me that she was yelling at ICE agents and had blocked their vehicles with her car. But what we don't know is how involved she may have been in some of these organizations that are doing that, whether she was kind of an independent bystander or if she was someone who was, tightly incorporated into the organizations that are protesting ICE.
Right. Miles Taylor, let's get to you. I mean, one thing that really struck me about this, and it's not the first time I had this impression in President Trump's second term, is how quick the administration was to jump on this incident and politicize it, frankly. I mean, you had Kirsty Noem appearing, I think, first of all, in Brownville, Texas, soon after the shooting, wearing a cowboy hat and basically saying that Renee Good was a domestic terrorist, without any shadow of a doubt, stating that she was using her vehicle, to try and harm ICE agents.
It was an act of domestic terrorism. What happened was our ICE officers were out in an enforcement action. They got stuck in the snow because of the adverse weather that is in Minneapolis. They were attempting to push out their vehicle, and a woman attacked them and those surrounding them and attempted to run them over and ram them with her vehicle.
She seemed to row back from that just a little bit later on in another statement that she made in Minneapolis later that day. And the president himself also, at first, seeming to jump on this. I mean, the fact that it's being politicized quite overtly by the administration and that you don't get the usual calls for calm that you would expect, how significant is that?
Well, look, all I can tell you is what I would have done when I was chief of staff at DHS, which I was in the previous Trump administration. I've been there with a lot of these same characters. And what I would tell you is after you have an officer shooting where an American citizen is killed, what you don't do is then fire more rhetorical shots because you dramatically increase the risk of escalation, inflaming the community, and putting more people in danger. And you certainly don't do that before you have all of the facts. And yet, as you noted, the secretary went out there publicly and said this was an act of domestic terrorism, accused the victim of being a terrorist. So if I was there right now, this is honestly the conversation I would be having. I would be talking to the secretary about resignations up and down the chain of command, up to and including her and my own, because this is the type of thing, this is the type of rhetoric, like I said, that is like follow-on shots after the incident itself. And keep in mind here, this week, here is the context. The administration was surging ICE agents into Minnesota under the auspices of investigating fishy accounting at kindergartens. Okay, fishy accounting at kindergartens.
That's not really an ICE issue, is it?
That's right. And they're responding with massive armed lethal force. So in a lot of ways to Americans, this has the hallmarks of Kent State 1970. That's when 4 unarmed student protesters were killed by the National Guard, and it set off a wave of protests in the United States. In a lot of ways, this feels like that.
Is there anyone, as far as you know, in your position today at the Department of Homeland Security who's having more difficult conversations with the Secretary, Kristi Noem, saying, don't go this far, you've overstepped a line, try and row it back? Or are they all basically, one team behind her and behind the president?
If there are folks of conscience, I've yet to see them. And I'll say this, watching how this played out, it's very clear to me that this is not a one-off or a fog of war accident. And you have to go back in time a little bit to see that Donald Trump has been conditioning ICE to shoot first and explain later. He's been doing that for months, and the message from the top has been pretty unmistakable. If you go back to July, for instance, the president melted down after protesters vandalized ICE cars. He said, these were brand new vehicles he'd given them, and they showed total disrespect for law and order. What he said after that was he was directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to give total authorization to use whatever means necessary against protester thugs. That's what the president said. And in the wake of that, we have seen ICE engage in illegal entry, warrantless arrests of U.S. citizens, violent assaults. I mean, things that I never saw the agency do when I was helping to oversee it. And now to a lot of Americans, that looks like the president has given them a license to kill. And we have not seen folks within the agencies stand up and say, Mr. President, we can't do this. If anything, they are reflexively defending officers, even when video shows it might be the indefensible.
Now, the administration would reply to that, hang on a minute, this is what the American people voted for. They knew what my anti-immigration agenda was when I was on the ballot last year. I won convincingly, and this is what they're now getting. ICE agents are going in there to deport people who shouldn't be in our country. That's what they would say.
Yeah, and I would respond to them that that's a bold lie. The three things they told America that ICE was going to do if Donald Trump got reelected was: one, ICE was going to go after dangerous criminal aliens; two, ICE would not be harassing U.S. citizens; and three, ICE would be following all rules and it would be following the law. Well, let's go to that first lie about ICE going after criminal aliens. If you look at the recent arrest statistics, only 10% of recently arrested and detained immigrants have criminal records. In other words, 90% of the people ICE is arresting right now are people without criminal records: students, families, parents, people who've been here for decades. Okay, that's a huge deal, and it's something that people are starting to pick up on and say, even conservatives like Joe Rogan, who supported this president, wait a second, Mr. President, you said we were going after criminal aliens, and now 9 in 10 of people you're picking up are not. That second lie about ICE not harassing U.S. citizens, I mean, Kristi Noem just testified before the U.S. Congress, no, we're not harassing U.S. citizens, in the wake of a report coming out showing that hundreds of Americans have been arrested by ICE, swept up in these raids. I'll remind folks, that's unconstitutional. That's against our United States Constitution. And then finally, that claim that ICE is following the law. And let me tell you what Tom Homan said this week, the border czar at the White House. He said, I have not seen ICE act outside of policy. I'll tell you what, either one of two things is true. Either Tom Homan knows he's lying through his teeth, or somehow he has secretly authorized ICE to break the law, because I know just as much about this as Tom, and I've watched every single day on social media feeds ICE do things that are completely outside of policy, the policy both Tom and I were responsible for implementing in that first Trump administration. So this is not what the American people voted for. They voted for something very different that was sold to them, and now the administration is moving the goalpost.
Although, to be fair to Tom Homan, he was also on CBS News last night saying, actually, let's not rush to judgment, in brackets, unlike some of my colleagues, and let's find out what the investigation, what the body cams actually, what story they tell on the ground. So I think, so he was slightly more judicious there than some of the people in the administration. Madison McVan, if I can get back to you. I mean, Miles referred to it, but how does it feel in Minneapolis? Does it feel like a city that is kind of under ICE occupation? And the mayor yesterday, using some very fruity language, amongst other things, referred to the fact that ICE was tearing families apart.
What they are doing is not to provide safety in America. What they are doing is causing chaos and distrust. They're ripping families apart. They're sowing chaos on our streets. And in this case, quite literally killing people.
Is that true? And give us some description of that.
Yes, it certainly feels like that. I was speaking to my editor today. He pointed out that the number of ICE agents in the Twin Cities right now is several times the size of the local police department. So it really does feel like they are everywhere. In terms of the way that they're carrying out their operations, they're getting in and out quickly. It seems like they're kind of going in, arresting one person or a small group, and then getting out before people really have time to congregate around them. Like I said before, that's kind of the goal of a lot of the residents, is to disrupt these things. Now they're getting in and out. So we're seeing these kind of isolated standoffs. And yesterday's shooting just really ramped up the stakes and made the tension significantly higher. I think we're also going to see more people going to these trainings, getting involved in these organizations that are combating ICE. I mean, you saw that in the turnout at the vigil last night. I mean, thousands of people on the block where Renee Good was shot, and the organizers at the vigil urging people to get involved in the groups that are working to protest and disrupt ICE operations.
And I think we should talk about Renee Good herself a bit. Tell us about her. I know she was 37-year-old and she had a 6-year-old son. Tell us a bit more about her. What kind of a person was she?
We're still learning about that. We know that she was a poet. We know that she played music. She was a recent arrival to the Twin Cities. We know she spent some time in Missouri and I believe Colorado. But, it's been just about 24 hours since she was killed. And we're still, working on getting in touch with people who knew her to really get a portrait of what kind of a person she was.
And just on Minnesota, I mean, we know the president just a few weeks ago launched this very aggressive tirade against the Somali community in your state, which is sizable, basically telling them to go back home, even though the majority of them are American citizens. So, I mean, Minnesota has been a bit of a battleground for this administration, hasn't it?
It has been. And, people outside the U.S. may recall that our governor, Tim Walz, was selected to be the vice presidential nominee. So that really put our governor and our state on the national scale. Tim Walz himself became a frequent target of Donald Trump. And that's continued even after Donald Trump won his reelection campaign. Tim Walz came back to Minnesota. And Walz actually, earlier this week, ended really, his campaign for a third term because of some of these fraud issues.
And just briefly on Governor Walz, what's he been saying? Is he, using a more cautious line than the mayor of Minneapolis? And, is he, I think he was suggesting possibly sending out the National Guard. Is that actually going to happen? Is that a possibility?
It's certainly a possibility. He has told the National Guard to be prepared to deploy if needed. Again, another parallel to 2020, Tim Walz activated the National Guard to quell some of the protests after the police murder of George Floyd. So we kind of just told them, be ready for something like that to happen again. A lot of the activists here want to see him use the National Guard to protect ICE. People from ICE. Yeah. Which, would spark a whole bunch of constitutional questions and possibly put an even bigger target on Minnesota's back.
I mean, Miles, what I find really fascinating is this prospect, which is potentially really alarming, of two agencies, one state and one federal, at loggerheads with each other. I mean, that's a recipe for division and disaster, isn't it? I mean, how worried are you about this whole, the texture of America kind of falling apart, coming apart at the seams, because, the federal government is using a federal agency, ICE, against state and local authority. And we saw this in Chicago. We saw this to some extent, in DC, where ICE agents were on the streets. Although, of course, there is no state here. But that's kind of worrying, isn't it, for the future of America?
Yeah, I mean, look, you don't have to take my word for it that the administration's falsehoods here are having an impact on Americans' confidence. In fact, if you look at Gallup polls, recent Gallup polls, trend lines in Americans' trust in the federal government are plummeting. They are absolutely plummeting year over year. What does that mean? Well, that means that overall public safety is damaged by this. So specifically when it comes to federal law enforcement, if members of the public are losing trust in law enforcement, I'll tell you, having, run what is the biggest law enforcement agency in America at DHS, if they don't trust you, they don't report crimes to you, they don't cooperate with you during investigations, and as a result, the criminal situation gets worse. Everyone is less safe. It also bleeds over into wider law enforcement. So when trust in federal law enforcement like ICE is going through the floor, people don't go check every police officer's badge and say, you're part of this agency or that agency. They start to lump them together in their heads. And so that overall social fabric is affected by this decreased faith in law enforcement. And I will tell you, from having talked to other law enforcement leaders, people at other agencies are really worried about this. They are saying what ICE is doing is making all of us look bad, and it's affecting public safety writ large. So that's the big macro concern right now with everything we are seeing with this agency.
It's interesting, actually, just on the stage behind Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, I think on both occasions yesterday, in Texas and in Minneapolis, you saw, a representative of the Army, of ICE, of the local police. None of them looked very happy, I have to say. They're all, you can just imagine that scenario that you've just outlined playing out in their own minds repeatedly under these circumstances. Miles, I just want you to tell me a little bit more about ICE, because we know that ICE was perhaps the biggest beneficiary of the big, beautiful budget.
That's right. I mean, ICE has now become the largest federal law enforcement agency in America. And as you note, larger than the armed forces of most nations. And it's still growing. And to staff that expansion, what the administration has done, because it's been very hard to meet those numbers, is they've lowered qualification standards while openly lowering recruitment standards and soliciting people from MAGA fan bases, from the president's fan bases that they know that they can inspire to come and join the mission. And they're doing that with memes and online propaganda about cleansing the homeland. I mean, some very, very provocative messaging to try to fill their ranks. The consequence, of course, is that law enforcement officials have warned that the agency is going to be fielding undertrained, underqualified, and ideologically motivated federal officers to roam the streets of American cities. And you combine that with the fact that the president is arming them with this use all means necessary authorities, you've got a recipe for many more incidents like we saw yesterday in Minnesota. So this is, in a sense, a witch's brew of potential corruption and violence we are seeing by making this agency so big, so fast, and unprepared to meet the moment.
So, Madison, I mean, we go back to the murder of George Floyd. The police officer who murdered him ended up being tried and convicted and, is in jail. And I'm sure that after that, the Minneapolis police tried really, really hard to repair relations with the local community and so on. So what was their attitude when they saw ICE officers behaving that they did yesterday and a few weeks before?
Yeah, Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara said, condemned the actions yesterday and basically said that he couldn't see any justification for using lethal force in that situation. Minneapolis, like many American cities, has what we call a separation ordinance, which means that local police are not allowed, according to city rules, to assist ICE in immigration enforcement. They can assist with criminal matters, but they're not supposed to help ICE arrest people solely because of their immigration status. So our local police leaders have reiterated that. But the scene on the ground is often confusing. Like Miles said, people aren't always thinking, what particular agency is this law enforcement officer with? There's a broader anti-law enforcement sentiment that's been growing because of the actions of ICE, that I do believe Minneapolis police see damaging their community relationships. When I was on the ground yesterday, in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Minneapolis police were present. City leaders said that was because this is an active crime scene. They're investigating. But people were insulting the police. They were throwing snowballs at them. So there's there certainly is a visible disconnect between the attitude of the leadership, or at least their public statements, and what the public perception of them is in Minneapolis right now.
I mean, Miles, what I find so alarming about the state of America today, and, it's been accelerated by the second Trump presidency, but it was there before as well, is that there are two rival versions of the truth here. Think back to what Kellyanne Conway, Trump's chief strategist, communications officer in the first administration said, these are our rival facts. So one half of America thinks that Renee Good was a domestic terrorist, and the other half of the country thinks that she was, murdered by ICE officers who are overreaching their power. The president, as far as I can see, has done very little to calm down tempers, and to make everyone step back from the brink a little bit, because that's not the way he operates. I mean, rival versions of truth about something like this, again, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It really is. And because there are rival versions, it doesn't mean that there's no objective truth. I mean, look, I will tell you, I remain a Republican and a conservative, but, I've spent 20 years responding to terrorist attacks in the United States, in the UK, in other countries, and terrorism has a very specific definition. It is intentional violence meant to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. And it is impossible for someone to show you that video from yesterday and prove to you, well, this is terrorism. This individual meant to intimidate or coerce the population of the United States by committing an act of violence. That's very hard to see there. But that message, because it was propagated so early by this administration, is being accepted by millions of people without a second thought that this was an act of terrorism. And that is very alarming because it expands beyond this incident. What happens when there's an act of terrorism? Well, what you do is you increase a law enforcement presence and you crack down on the potential perpetrators. There are folks inside this administration, people I worked with in the first Trump administration, who have been waiting for and looking for a pretext for a domestic terrorism crackdown on the political opposition in the United States. So the fear right now is that this incident and others like it will be used to try to goad the opposition to overreact, to try to get protests to be violent, to justify the administration's crackdowns. Because right now, 2,000 ICE officers in a state that has accounting problems with kindergartens does not seem to meet the moment. Seems like an overreaction on the side of government. And so this administration is looking for a way to justify that visually. And that's why they're hoping that the opposition overreacts. And it's one more reason why commentators are out there saying when people protest, which they will, and it's likely that these protests become nationwide this weekend, that they need to do so peacefully. That's very, very important to remind folks in moments like these.
Okay, and Madison, in that context, it's quite interesting that the mayor of Minneapolis used, some pretty unacceptable language, for primetime television. He used the F word when he told ICE to get the F out of Minneapolis. I'm sure that played very well with some of the crowd, but is that helpful, that kind of language, when you consider how bitter the divisions are? And do the people who are kind of organizing against ICE, the grassroots organizations, and I saw them operating in DC, by the way, in the summer, and it was really fascinating to see how quick they were to organize stuff and warn people about the presence of ICE. Do they get that message, what Miles has just outlined? Will they hold back a little bit, or will they double down on the demonstrations?
I think whether or not his rhetoric was helpful depends on your perspective. Was it helpful in de-escalating the tensions that we're feeling? Probably not. But when you look at the city politics, the local feelings here, a lot of people share his sentiment. Get ICE out of here as fast as you can. So potentially helpful in, creating, better sentiment for the mayor in this town. He's actually been very criticized by a lot of the people who are involved in these immigrant rights groups. So we actually saw him more aligned with these groups. Well, he was mayor during the police killing of George Floyd. So he took a lot of the heat for criticism of the police at that time. And so just like the police department, he's been trying to repair his relationships with the community, particularly, civil rights activists, immigrant rights organizations, those kinds of things. So he was actually more with them yesterday than I've seen in a while.
Interesting. I mean, maybe he's trying to repair some past damage there himself. Miles, back to you. I mean, the one question I keep being asked when I'm back in the UK is how likely is it that the Trump administration will try and somehow, scrap the midterm elections, come up with some excuse to delay them, use emergency powers in order to shoot demonstrators on the streets. I mean, these very, very dark scenarios, which are played out on various Hollywood screens, but not necessarily on the streets. Bring us back to planet reality. How likely is it that the administration will use some of the things that we've seen and take them to the next level?
Well, two things are true here. Unfortunately, these aren't conspiracy theories because they come from the president's mouth. I mean, they're things he wants to do. However, he doesn't have the authority to do them. So let me start with elections and shooting unarmed people. Look, Donald Trump has speculated about canceling elections in the United States. He does not have the authority to do that. Donald Trump has speculated about shooting unarmed civilians. I was on the receiving end of some of those initial directives years ago when he told us he wanted to shoot people in the legs at the border. I was the one who came out publicly and talked about that because it was so alarming. Now, we had to remind the president that under the military's rules of engagement, no, we could not do that. No, that was not lawful. But he continued to say things like that throughout his term. So again, like I said, these are things that the president of the United States thinks and says and intends to do, and yet the law doesn't permit him to do it.
Sorry to interrupt, Miles. Is anyone reminding him today that he can't do that, as you reminded him then?
I worry that they're not. I mean, let me give you a very recent example. Let's look at Greenland. I was also one of the first people to be on the receiving end of the president's request that we take over Greenland. Now, that's something that we conveyed to the president and the White House. We thought was an absurd idea and is something that we shrugged off. Now, in a second Trump administration, he's surrounded by advisors who are trying to goad him into taking over the territory of a NATO ally. That is a marked contrast. And I think we are seeing that on a lot of issues in this second Trump administration. There are not people telling him to follow domestic and international law. There are people trying to find him workarounds to domestic and international law. But as it relates to elections, look, I'll say this. The president doesn't have the authority to cancel elections. But I do believe he will try to engage in efforts that you would characterize as voter suppression, try to get the political opposition in certain areas to make it harder for them to vote, to decrease their likelihood of voting so that his party is more likely to win. Those are what we're going to be looking out for, those types of efforts of voter suppression. And it's going to be something that the American people need to be very, very aware of. Know your rights training used to be a really boring bureaucratic term. You're going to see around the United States in 2026 a lot of organizations reminding the American people what their constitutional and legal rights are because of what's happening from their government.
But to conclude, this first week of the year 2026 was a pretty sobering week in which we were reminded at the beginning of the week with the actions in Venezuela that America thinks might is right, and the same thing at the end of the week or towards the end of the week on the frozen streets of Minneapolis.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And look, I respond to this as someone who has spent many years saying Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela should be removed from power. As someone who's been saying for many years, we need to fix a broken immigration policy in the United States. But neither of those policies, the way they've been executed by this administration, have been done in a way that is lawful. There's a right way and a wrong way to go about things. And I think what's starting to concern so many people, and not just Democrats in the United States, independents and disaffected Republicans, is that this administration is carrying out actions that federal judges continue to find are contrary to the Constitution. Dozens of federal judges have ruled this administration has violated the Constitution. And in that regard, we are in uncharted territory.
Okay, on that sobering note, that's it for the forecast. Miles Taylor, Madison McVan, thank you very much to both of you for coming on this edition of the forecast. I hope you found it interesting. I certainly did. See you next time.